I still remember the exact sound my truck made when I pulled into the driveway that Tuesday afternoon because it was drowned out by something that absolutely did not belong there. The sharp plastic rattle of a brand new white vinyl fence swaying in the breeze. At first, I honestly thought one of my neighbors had started a landscaping project, but then I looked a little closer and felt that strange sinking feeling in my stomach that only comes when your brain sees something your heart refuses to believe. The fence wasn't next door. It wasn't near my property. It was sitting right across the front of my side lot, cutting it off like it had never belonged to me in the first place. Attached to one of the fence posts was a laminated sign that read, Community Nature Buffer, HOA Shared Green Space. I actually laughed out loud because it felt so ridiculous. Then I realized nobody else was laughing. My name is Daniel Mercer, and for almost 12 years I'd lived in a quiet neighborhood outside Cedar Ridge, Tennessee. It wasn't fancy, just one of those places where people waved while walking their dogs. Kids rode bicycles until the porch lights came on, and every Saturday morning somebody somewhere was mowing a lawn before 8 even though everyone secretly hated that guy. I liked living there. My wife, Emily, used to joke that the best thing about our house wasn't the kitchen or the view. It was that odd little side lot nobody else wanted. It stretched between our garage and the HOA's common meadow, just wide enough for my boat trailer, a vegetable garden Emily insisted on planting every spring, and a gravel path that led to the side gate. After Emily passed away 3 years earlier, that little patch of land became something more than property. It became therapy. I'd spend evenings pulling weeds, growing tomatoes she would have been proud of, or simply sitting on an old folding chair, watching the sun disappear behind the oak trees. Maybe that's why seeing that fence hit me harder than it should have. It wasn't just land. It felt personal. I climbed out of my truck, walked straight to the fence, and stared at the fresh concrete around the posts. Somebody hadn't just planned this. They'd invested time and money into pretending my property belonged to someone else. 2 women walking their dogs slowed down across the street. One gave me that awkward smile people wear when they know something uncomfortable is happening but don't want to become part of it. The other finally shrugged and said, I figured they must have talked to you already. I turned toward her. Who? She hesitated. The HOA board. They've been talking for months about making this whole corner look more unified. Unified. That word stuck with me the whole evening. Nobody had called me. Nobody had emailed me. Nobody had knocked on my door. There hadn't been a vote, a notice, or even a fake attempt to ask permission. Someone had simply decided my land looked better if everyone else could pretend it belonged to them. I walked the entire fence line, took dozens of pictures, then unlocked the gate from my side just to prove to myself it really blocked access to my own property. It did. My trailer couldn't get through anymore. Half the garden sat behind their new community space. The next morning I drove straight to the management office. The property manager, a polished man named Leonard Cross, greeted me with the kind of rehearsed smile that disappears the second someone asks an inconvenient question. Morning, Daniel. What can I do for you? I didn't bother sitting down. You can explain why there's a fence on my property. His smile barely moved. Yes. The board approved the enhancement project during last month's meeting. Enhancement project? I asked. That's my land. He folded his hands together like he was explaining math to a child. Well, technically your parcel sits between 2 HOA common areas. The architectural committee felt it functions more naturally as part of the community landscape. I blinked twice because I honestly thought I'd misheard him. Functions more naturally? I repeated. Leonard, are you telling me the board voted to take private property because they liked the way it looked? His expression tightened. Nobody's taking anything, Daniel. We're simply improving the neighborhood's appearance. I leaned forward until we were only a couple feet apart. Then show me the document giving the HOA authority to fence off land listed under my deed. For the first time, he looked uncomfortable. I'll have legal send something over. Today? Soon? I nodded once, thanked him, and walked out. The funny thing about people who bluff is they always expect you to bluff back. Leonard expected an argument, maybe a shouting match, maybe another angry homeowner storming into the next board meeting. Instead, I drove home, opened the fireproof box in my office, pulled out every closing document from the day I bought the house, and spread them across the dining room table. 3 hours later, I wasn't angry anymore. I was calm, because every page told exactly the same story. The county records matched my deed. The tax maps matched the survey from 12 years ago. Every square foot of that side lot legally belonged to me. That's when I stopped asking whether the HOA had made a mistake and started wondering why they were so confident they could get away with it. The answer to that question would change everything. The first thing I did the next morning wasn't call a lawyer. It wasn't post about it online. And it definitely wasn't march back into the HOA office looking for another argument. I called a licensed land surveyor named Owen Barrett, a guy who'd spent nearly 30 years settling property disputes across 3 counties. When I explained what had happened, he was quiet for a couple of seconds before asking one simple question. Daniel, did they actually pour concrete for the fence posts? Every single one. He let out a slow whistle. Well, if your paperwork is as clean as you say it is, somebody just made themselves a very expensive mistake. Hearing that felt strangely reassuring. Owen arrived 3 days later driving an old pickup that looked older than both of us combined. He wasn't flashy. He carried faded field notebooks, weathered equipment cases, and the kind of confidence that only comes from spending decades proving people wrong with measurements instead of opinions. While he unloaded his gear, Mrs. Holloway from across the street wandered over carrying 2 cups of coffee. "You finally fighting back?" she asked with a grin. I smiled. "Just making sure I'm not crazy," she laughed. "Honey, around here, proving you're not crazy usually costs money." Owen spent nearly 4 hours measuring every corner of the lot. He searched for original iron pins buried beneath years of soil, checked historical plats, compared county coordinates, then repeated several measurements just to eliminate even the smallest possibility of error. I stayed out of his way, watching from the porch, trying not to let my mind run too far ahead. Every once in a while, he'd wave another orange survey flag into the ground without saying a word. By late afternoon, the property looked like someone had decorated it for Halloween, using bright fluorescent stakes instead of pumpkins. Finally, he walked over carrying a clipboard. "You were right." "How right?" I asked. He pointed toward the white fence. "Every single post they installed sits inside your property line. Not close to it. Inside it. Some by almost 6 feet. I looked back toward the fence and felt something shift inside me. The uncertainty disappeared. I wasn't defending an opinion anymore. I was defending a documented fact. Owen handed me a certified survey map and smiled. "Frame this one if you want. You're going to enjoy watching people read it." That evening, I assembled everything into one package. Copies of my deed, county tax records, Owen's certified survey, photographs of the fence, and a formal notice demanding the HOA remove every inch of it within 14 calendar days. I even paid extra to have the package hand-delivered and signed for because I wanted absolutely no debate later about whether they'd received it. 2 days passed. Nothing. 4 days? Nothing. A week? Still nothing. Then, almost as if they wanted to remind me how untouchable they believed they were, I received an email from the board president, Cynthia Rollins. It was only 4 sentences long. "The board has reviewed your concerns. Our legal committee believes the Community Enhancement Project complies with HOA authority. The fence will remain in place. Thank you for your understanding." I read it 3 times because I honestly couldn't believe someone would put that in writing. Emily used to tell me there were 2 kinds of arrogant people, the loud ones and the dangerous quiet ones. Cynthia belonged to the second group. She wasn't screaming. She wasn't threatening. She simply believed she had enough power that reality would eventually adjust itself around her decisions. I almost admired the confidence. Almost. My friend Mark called that evening after hearing about everything through neighborhood gossip. "You gonna sue them?" he asked. "Maybe." "Then why are you smiling?" I looked out the kitchen window toward the fence glowing white under the porch light. "Because lawsuits take forever, and I think there's a faster solution." The deadline expired on a Monday. Tuesday came and went. Wednesday morning, the fence still stood exactly where they'd left it. That afternoon, I visited the county planning office and filed a formal encroachment documentation report, attaching every photograph, survey, and correspondence I'd collected. The clerk behind the counter flipped through the paperwork before raising an eyebrow. "You've been organized." I shrugged. "I've had 2 weeks," she smiled. "That's usually enough time for the truth to become obvious." Walking back to my truck, I realized something interesting had happened over those 2 weeks. My emotions had changed. At first, I'd been angry, then offended, then determined. Now I felt patient. The kind of patience that comes from knowing the facts aren't on a timer. Facts don't panic. They don't need to win arguments. They simply wait for everyone else to run out of excuses. Thursday morning, I called a local fencing contractor. The owner, Miguel Alvarez, listened carefully while I explained the situation. Before agreeing to anything, He asked for copies of the survey and deed. I appreciated that. A man willing to verify the facts before accepting a job was exactly the kind of professional I wanted. An hour after emailing the documents, my phone rang. "Mr. Mercer?" Miguel said. "Yeah, I've looked everything over." A brief pause. "That fence doesn't belong on your property. Can you remove it?" Another pause. Then he laughed softly. "Legally? Absolutely. It'll take maybe 90 minutes with the right crew." Wednesday morning, 8 o'clock. Perfect. I barely slept the night before. Not because I was nervous about the fence coming down. I was wondering how the board would react once they realized confidence wasn't a legal strategy. At exactly 7:52 the next morning, Miguel's trucks rolled into my driveway. 3 workers stepped out, unloaded tools, and reviewed the survey map one final time. At 8,001, the first fence panel came loose. It was strangely satisfying to watch. No yelling. No revenge speeches. Just experienced workers calmly reversing a mistake someone else had made. The sound of impact drivers echoed through the neighborhood as one section after another disappeared. Neighbors slowly drifted outside carrying coffee mugs, pretending they were watering flowers or checking mail while secretly watching every minute of the show. Mrs. Holloway sat in a lawn chair directly across the street without even pretending anymore. Around 40 minutes into the job, a black SUV came flying around the corner much faster than anyone should have been driving inside the neighborhood. Cynthia climbed out before the vehicle had completely stopped. "What do you think you're doing?" she shouted across the yard. Miguel didn't even look up. "Removing materials installed on private property." She pointed directly at me. "You can't authorize this." I calmly held up Owen's certified survey. "Actually, I can." She marched toward the nearest worker. "Stop immediately." Miguel finally stood up, took off his gloves, and spoke in the calmest voice I'd heard all week. "Ma'am, my crew works for the property owner listed on the deed. If you believe otherwise, you're welcome to contact law enforcement. Until then, we're continuing." Cynthia looked around expecting someone to support her. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. The only sound was another fence panel being lifted free from the concrete anchors. She turned back toward me, her face turning bright red. "You'll regret embarrassing this board." I smiled. Not because I wanted to humiliate her, but because I suddenly understood something she'd never expected. This had stopped being about power the moment the survey stakes went into the ground. From that moment forward, it was only about facts. And facts don't lose sleep over opinions. By 9:28, the last section of white vinyl had been stacked neatly on the HOA side of the property line, waiting for whoever had paid for it to figure out what came next. I had a feeling the morning wasn't over yet. I figured that would be the end of it. The fence was gone. My property was open again. And the survey stakes were standing exactly where they'd always belonged. But about 20 minutes after Miguel's crew packed up their tools, my phone rang. The name on the screen read Leonard Cross. Funny how confidence changes its tone once the facts become impossible to ignore. His voice, which had sounded so polished the week before, was almost hesitant now. "Daniel, the board would like to meet with you this afternoon." I leaned against the porch railing and looked across my little garden where the tomato plants were finally getting enough sunlight again. "About what?" I asked, even though I already knew. "We'd like to discuss possible compensation and a mutually agreeable resolution." I couldn't help smiling. A week earlier, they hadn't wanted a conversation. They'd wanted compliance. Now they wanted compromise. "Leonard," I said quietly, "there isn't anything left to negotiate. My property is back where it belongs." He cleared his throat. "Surely we can avoid unnecessary legal complications." "The unnecessary complication," I replied, "was putting a fence on land you never owned." After a few seconds of silence, he simply wished me a good afternoon and hung up. That was the last phone call I ever received from him. A few days later, I drove past the community clubhouse on my way to the hardware store. The monthly HOA meeting was about to begin, and the parking lot was fuller than I'd ever seen it. Mrs. Holloway caught me outside before I could leave. She laughed and said, "You know they're talking about you in there." I shrugged. "Probably." She grinned even wider. "Not the way they used to." Apparently, word had spread faster than the board expected. Neighbors had started asking uncomfortable questions. If the HOA could fence off my lot without permission, what stopped them from doing something similar to someone else? Some homeowners wanted copies of meeting minutes. Others asked to see financial records for the fence project. A few even questioned why the board ignored a certified survey instead of verifying ownership before spending association money. The issue had quietly transformed from one homeowner's dispute into something much larger: trust. It turned out people don't mind rules nearly as much as they mind leaders who believe the rules don't apply to themselves. About 2 weeks later, I received a certified letter from the HOA's attorney. I expected another threat. Instead, it contained a formal acknowledgement that the parcel was privately owned, confirmation that the association claimed no future interest in it, and a statement that any landscaping or improvement projects would require written permission from the property owner going forward. It wasn't exactly an apology. Lawyers rarely write those, but it was the closest thing to one that mattered. I folded the letter, placed it inside the same fireproof box that held my deed, and realized something Emily used to tell me had been true all along. People who ignore boundaries usually don't stop until someone calmly redraws them. That sentence stayed with me, not because it was about property lines, but because it applies to so many parts of life. Looking back now, the fence was never the real problem. The real problem was the assumption behind it, the belief that if enough people acted confidently, ownership somehow became negotiable. It doesn't. Facts don't become less true because a committee votes against them. A deed doesn't disappear because someone prints a nicer sign, and respect for your neighbors means nothing if it isn't built on respect for their rights first. Today my side lot looks almost exactly the way it did before all this happened. The boat trailer sits where it always has. The gravel path leads to the side gate. Emily's vegetable garden is thriving again, and every summer when I pick the first ripe tomato, I think about how close I came to letting someone else convince me that keeping the peace was more important than standing my ground. I'm glad I didn't, because here's the lesson I learned. You don't have to be the loudest person in the neighborhood to protect what's yours. You don't need dramatic speeches or angry confrontations. Sometimes the strongest move is simply gathering the facts, staying patient, and letting the truth do the talking. The survey stakes said more than I ever could, so now I'm curious what you think. If your HOA had quietly fenced off part of your property and insisted it belonged to the community, would you have tried to work it out, called an attorney immediately, or done exactly what I did and let a professional survey settle the argument once and for all? Let me know down in the comments because I read every one of them, and I'm always interested to hear how other people would have handled a situation like this. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe for more real neighborhood conflict stories, and share this with someone who believes property rights should never depend on who has the most power. Sometimes the smallest piece of land reveals the biggest truths about people.